None of the content on this or any episode of the Kratom Science Podcast, Kratom Science Journal Club, or on any page of kratomscience.com is intended, nor should it be considered, medical claims or medical advice. This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for kratomscience.com, your source for all things Kratom. My guest is Dr. Peter Grinspoon, instructor at Harvard Medical School, PCP at Mass General Hospital. His new book is Seeing Through the Smoke. A cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. Released on 4/20/23.
Awesome. How are you today?
Good. I'm great. Thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate it. And it's Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. And it's a great book for drug nerds and everybody else. It's loaded with science. And I just got it in on Friday, and I've been spending all weekend reading it. And I also attended the grand opening of the Cannabis Museum in Athens, Ohio. So it's been a weed-filled weekend for me. So yeah, I really appreciate it. And this is the Kratom Science Podcast, but there are a lot of parallels and definitely a crossover community. I have a container of legal medicinal marijuana right here on my desk. I owe some gratitude to your father for his pioneering work in reducing the stigma around cannabis. And just, I guess, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I am a primary care doctor at Harvard and a cannabis specialist at my hospital, Mass General Hospital. I've been involved in the drug issue my entire life. The main drug that I'm involved with is cannabis, both because, as you alluded to, my dad was a very famous cannabis scholar for the last 50 years of his life, but also because my brother Danny, when I was growing up, used medical cannabis to try to contend with the side effects of the chemotherapy regimen he was on during his losing fight with childhood leukemia. So I knew cannabis, legitimate plant-based medication, before starting medical school. And I've been sort of very interested in treating patients and learning about the science, again, both because of my brother's experience and because of my dad being a cannabis scholar my entire career. I do also want to mention that I'm 15 years in recovery from opiate addiction. My first book was about my struggles, how a doctor gets addicted and unaddicted to opiates. So I've written about Kratom, and I've argued that it needs to be studied and legalized and regulated because it really helps people with chronic pain and with addiction, certainly not criminalized. So while my focus is on cannabis, I'm a huge supporter of Kratom and a huge supporter of psychedelics as well.
Yeah, you did write an article in 2019, Kratom, Fear-Worthy Foliage or Beneficial Botanical. And yeah, that was an excellent article. And I think you nailed kind of the problems with the Kratom. You said distortion from corporate interests, anti-drug ideology, and romanticism by Kratom enthusiasts. And I've been writing about Kratom for about 4.5 years. And in my work, I try to talk about all the problems and not just do one side or the other, because I see that this helps people, but I also want to make sure that it's not oversold by the industry as a cure for anything, and it keeps them safe. That's a lot of the parallels with marijuana is like that too. I mean, you talked about cancer. People say, oh, it cures cancer, but that's not entirely true.
Well, yeah, cannabis doesn't cure cancer yet. We're studying it. I mean, interestingly, different components of cannabis are really effective at killing cancer cells in the lab. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised if eventually cannabis becomes part of our chemotherapy regimens. But right now, we haven't shown in humans that cannabis cures cancer. So it's dangerous when someone goes and uses cannabis instead of seeing an oncologist and using chemotherapy. You know, most oncologists are in favor of cannabis, and cannabis is excellent for the symptoms of cancer, the pain, the anxiety, the insomnia, and obviously it's extremely helpful, like it was when my brother was Danny was dying in the 1970s for chemotherapy. So cannabis really helps with the symptoms of cancer and the symptoms of cancer treatment, but hasn't been shown to cure cancer yet. So stay tuned. And if you have cancer, go ahead and use cannabis for the symptoms, but also see your oncologist for treating the cancer. So,
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to talk about the history a little bit. That's what the book starts off. Near the beginning of cannabis prohibition, it seems like the medical establishment mostly went along with reefer madness and Anslinger. Other than you talk about the LaGuardia Committee and some others, but they mostly went along with it despite knowing it was bullshit. Why exactly did that happen?
well, one of my favorite chapters in my book is about doctors and the war on drugs. And this pertains not just to cannabis, but to psychedelics, kratom, opiates, many other drugs. It's called Do Be No Harm, sort of a play on the words do no harm, because doctors are supposed to do no harm. But we did a ton of harm by being on the wrong side of the war on drugs. And doctors have sort of been victims of and perpetrators of all the nonsense and misinformation coming down from the US government for the last 50 years on cannabis. Ironically, cannabis was widely used and prescribed in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and physicians at that point were generally in favor of it. When they criminalized cannabis in 1937, one of the leading voices against criminalization was the American Medical Association. They testified that this is a safe and helpful drug. They were overruled, as you mentioned, by Anslinger, who had this very racist and kind of based on competing commercial interests agenda to criminalize cannabis. Health and safety were never part of why they criminalized cannabis in the first place, which is really interesting. And then the doctors were under a lot of political pressure to get in line with the government's mission. And sadly, instead of being independent and speaking up for their beliefs and their patients, they sort of just adopted the whole drug war platform about cannabis and other drugs, hook, line, and sinker. And I've been critical of them, but I can say that doctors are now switching back, and most of them are in favor of legalizing certainly medical cannabis. So we're making progress, but I don't think the medical profession has, really much to be proud of in terms of the last 50 years with cannabis policy.
You cite a lot of even modern studies where that war on drugs mentality is still kind of residual and it's still kind of in the science. Why does it actually still happen? For example, why is like the endocannabinoid system not yet taught in medical school despite it being discovered in 1990?
Well, that's a great question. The endocannabinoid system is the system of neurotransmitters and receptors by which cannabis works its effects. It also regulates many, many other things in our body, like critical things like memory, learning, emotions, temperature, reproduction, appetite. And as a hangover from the war on drugs, remember, for the last half century, only studies into the harms of cannabis were funded by the US government. And no studies or researchers looking into the benefits were funded. So there wasn't a lot of interest in anything positive about cannabis, including learning about the endocannabinoid system. Today, if you're a doctor, whether you're pro or anti-cannabis, just to be a good doctor, you have to understand things like the endocannabinoid system. So it's urgent that we teach doctors about this, but it is only taught in 13% of medical schools. And I'm a little bit mystified by this. I mean, the simple answer is that it's a hangover from the war on drugs. These conservative institutions, and a lot of the medical societies get a lot of money from pharma. They just haven't been interested in patients using cannabis. There's a lot of institutional momentum and conservatism to overcome, but it is very shocking that it's not being taught, because to be a good doctor is to be an educated doctor, and this stuff is really integral to what we need to know.
And there's been a lot in the history of like the government actually trying to shut down people that were doing research in cannabis, particularly if they showed positive results. For example, you write about Marcus Conant, who had to fight for the right to just talk about cannabis with AIDS patients.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, the war on cannabis users, I'm sure a lot of people will feel echoes and similarities with the war on kratom users. The war on cannabis users has been disgraceful, and I have a whole chapter on that. And with Marcus Conant, California legalized medical cannabis in 1996, which was 3 years after my dad's book came out, Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, which provided a lot of the background to enable them to legalize it. And the government, Barry Caffrey, I believe, was the drug czar. They were trying to intimidate doctors, arrest them, take away their license, sort of blacklist them if they actually followed the law in California and recommended medical cannabis. So There's a whole bunch of doctors that stood up against this. There were lawsuits, and now we're in this strange situation where medical cannabis is legal in 40 states, and it's still illegal at the federal level. It's the most incoherent thing ever. And what's incoherent is the federal illegality, not the illegality, given that 94% of Americans currently support legal access to medical cannabis. So, Biden's talking about descheduling. I think we need to fully legalize, but we're just going to have a incoherent policy until the federal government catches up with the states, and frankly, until the doctors catch up with the patients.
Just to stay on the topic of doctors, you talk about there are doctors who just write off all cannabis use as abuse, and then on the other hand, like how I got my medical card, you call a guy up, say you have this and this, and he says, okay, you got a medical card, here's, give $50 to the state, and here it is in the mail. Can you just talk about that kind of dichotomy a little bit?
Yeah, no, I don't think either of them is very healthy. I mean, like all other, just like Kratom, as we were talking about earlier, like there are benefits, there are harms, and you have to take both into account. It's not a wonder drug that can cure everything, but it certainly shouldn't be criminalized. I think patients need legal access to medical cannabis. It's safer than many of the other drugs we use, such as painkillers or sedatives for insomnia. So it's harm reduction to have people have access. At the same time, I'm a big advocate in educating patients. Like when I counsel and certify medical cannabis patients, I educate them about the harms and the benefits. I spend a lot of time talking to them, and I make sure they understand medication interactions, to start low and to go slow so they don't take too much and have a really anxiety attack, an awful experience. There's a lot of education that needs to be done. So I think something between those two extremes of doctors saying no medical use and sticking their heads in the sand, and other doctors wanting to make a quick buck and just certifying patients without really educating or counseling them, there has to be something in between the two.
You have recommendations about how to talk to your PCP about the use of cannabis. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge believer in open communication between doctors and patients. To not communicate doesn't work at all. A lot of the problem with communication is coming from the doctors. They don't know much about it, so they sort of shut down the conversation. They don't know how to advise patients. So it's urgent that we educate doctors and nurses about cannabis. Then the doctors complain that patients get their information from the bud tenders, who in truth shouldn't be giving out medical advice because they're not medically trained. But most studies show that people want to get the information from their doctors but can't. So educating doctors is critical. And I think just like with any drug or medicine, a little bit of education goes a long way in terms of having people use it safely. Like you don't necessarily have to smoke it. You could use a dry herb vaporizer, which doesn't incinerate it. It just heats it up. So it's safer for your lungs. There's less crap in it when you inhale. I mean, there are some very, very simple ways to educate patients. And again, this is true for opiates, for cannabis, for kratom, for benzodiazepines. It's all about having educated doctors and open doctor-patient communication. We could save lives by doing this. Not with cannabis, because you can't fatally overdose with cannabis, but we certainly could save lives with all the other drugs with open communication between doctors and patients.
You write about two groups you call reefer pessimists and Cannatopians. The one thing that stuck with me that you said that they kind of radicalize each other over the years, and that's certainly happening in the Kratom world as well. And can you just speak about the dynamics of that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for example, you're someone who believes in cannabis, and you use it, but you should want to know about the harms. Because with any drug or medicine, you want to know the benefits, the harms, the right dose. Are there any contaminants? How do you use this safely? You don't want to harm yourself. And, with cannabis, the U.S. government really lied about it for half a century. And the problem is now when a new study comes out about harm, right? Say a study comes out and says not safe during pregnancy. Many of the cannabis proponents or advocates will just reflexively and automatically dismiss that study as, oh, that's yet another U.S. government propaganda piece. And that's a very dangerous attitude, if you ask me. I've even had patients say the government was lying about cannabis. Why should I get a vaccine? They're probably lying about that too. And when the government squanders its credibility, it really digs itself into a hole. At the same time, the reefer pessimists, the people who are against cannabis. Many of the psychiatrists, they tend to be very biased against it for a whole variety of reasons that I go over in my book. And, they still put medical marijuana in quotation marks, which is derogatory and dismissive. And that kind of attitude makes it impossible for patients to have a good talk with their doctors. And again, that's dangerous because then they just don't tell the doctors, and the doctors don't know and might give them other medications that interact with the cannabis. So both sides over time tend to get annoyed at the other's message, and then sort of, and again, also we have these state by state legalization referendums and votes. And whenever there's a vote or a contest, both sides have to brandish their most extreme arguments, right? You don't see ads saying, well, cannabis is helpful, but also has these harms. In the referendums, you see cannabis is great or cannabis is awful. And again, I think not only the two sides, but the process of how we're legalizing it is radicalizing the two sides and making each of them a little bit more extreme. So, but in the background, society is vastly shifting to be pro and accepting of cannabis. So that sort of gives a little more, credibility and ammunition to the pro cannabis people. But part of why I wrote the book is to try to get everybody more on the same page, to go over what actually are the harms? What does it do during pregnancy? How dangerous is it to drive on cannabis? Does it affect your memory as an adult? What about as a teen? And all the benefits. Can it help with autism? Can it help, as we discussed, with cancer or cancer pain? Is it addictive? Can it help with chronic pain? Can it help get people off opiates? So I try to go through all of these. I explain the arguments from both sides. Then I go through the latest science, and then I come up what I think, having been involved in this issue my whole life, is a reasonable middle path that we could all move forward with.
Yeah, and I definitely wanted to get into the science, but I have one more question, sort of about the politics. You bring up Big Pharma in the book in a couple of places. What role does Big Pharma play? Because I know there's a Kratom community narrative that the FDA is trying to shut down Kratom because it's going to replace a lot of these drugs that are Big Pharma's trying to sell. In a sense, it's true. A lot of people are using Kratom. And do you think there's any truth to the narrative that the FDA and Big Pharma are trying to shut down botanicals?
Certainly, Big Pharma makes money on their medications, and they lose money on botanicals. So there's plausible. And then you look at how Big Pharma has handled the cannabis issue. They have been opposed to all of the legalization referendums. They've been working very hard to keep cannabis illegal, while at the same time they've been developing their own cannabis-like or cannabis-based medications based on the endocannabinoid system to help alleviate the symptoms that medicinal cannabis can alleviate. So in that schema, exactly what you are saying would come to pass. Cannabis would be illegal, and your only choice for relief would be to buy an expensive pharmaceutical from Big Pharma. So, and it's documented that Big Pharma has opposed every single attempt to legalize medical marijuana in the same way that they seem to be opposed to Kratom. Now, how direct a role the money has versus how much of this is cultural and political is a little bit hard to say. I mean, there certainly was a direct role as Big Pharma was contributing to the anti-legalization campaign in every single state. Recently with cannabis, now it's legal in 40 states. The dam is breaking in terms of cannabis legalization, though you certainly still could get arrested if you're in, Idaho or Nebraska. We have a lot of work to do. Big Pharma's taking a more, if we can't beat them, join them. And they're just not really fighting against legalization. They're more trying to take over the industry. I mean, the activists have legalized cannabis, working hard for the last 50 years. And now a lot of people are quite concerned that Big Pharma, tobacco, and alcohol, all of whom opposed cannabis legalization because they didn't want the competition. Now that it's becoming legalized, they're colonizing the industry and trying to take it over. So, this has a lot of very interesting implications for Kratom, which might be a little bit beyond, the scope of what we could do today. But there's this big fight over Kratom with some people wanting to criminalize it and other people wanting to, including me, to legalize it and to regulate it so that it's safe and available to people. Why shouldn't they be allowed to use a botanical medication? It doesn't kill people unless it's contaminated. And, as long as people are educated and make an informed choice and know that some people can get addicted to it, it's not illegal for alcohol just because you can get addicted. And it'll be really interesting to see how the Kratom legalization thing plays out. And I agree with you that pharma is not at all interested in legalizing kratom because they lose money. But, I just don't know how specifically involved they are in the policy at this point.
In the kratom world, we have a lot of real-world evidence. I mean, I produced a 250-page document of just first-person testimonies that were posted on our website alone. But that's not exactly science, but that could probably be considered real-world evidence. There's a history of traditional use where it doesn't seem to have harmed people too much, versus the more rigid, random controlled trials. Real-world evidence is rejected as being too anecdotal, but you actually point out there's drawbacks to the RCTs as well that can still contradict the reality. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, randomized controlled trials are considered like the gold standard for doctors because, they're double blinded, they're placebo controlled. The doctor doesn't know what you got. The patient doesn't know what you got. And that factors out the placebo effect so that if someone gets better with the study drug as opposed to the placebo, there's a real effect. And these are really important studies, but we don't have randomized controlled trials for every medication that we use in medicine. And there's a real double standard. We don't have a RCT, a randomized controlled trial for cannabis. They say, oh, there's no evidence for it. But tons of stuff we do in medicine doesn't have randomized controlled trials. Our treatment for cannabis addiction, some people get addicted to cannabis. There's not a single FDA-approved drug for cannabis addiction, but they still use Ambien or gabapentin or all kinds of medications to help people with the side effects of cannabis withdrawal. And I just think there's always been this big double standard. And the other thing is it's hard to blind people with psychoactive substances. Most people will know if they're given 20 milligrams of cannabis or THC or a placebo because they will feel high. That's part of why people have been using it for 5,000 years. The same with kratom. It's going to be, there are many different components to kratom. It's not just studying one molecule. And people feel the effect. So it's very hard to do randomized controlled trials. And more and more we're recognizing that real world evidence, like patient reported outcomes, patient registries, insurance data, we use these all the time for a drug comes out for post-marketing surveillance. This is really, really valuable evidence. And in some ways it might be more applicable to kratom or to cannabis because again, these are complicated botanical molecules, complicated plants. They have many, kratom has dozens, cannabis has hundreds of different molecules. So it's really hard to just test it. They do several things at once. They help with pain, with anxiety. The randomized controlled trials usually just test for one metric at a time and really miss a lot of what cannabis and kratom would do. And also, you feel the effect of kratom. You're going to be able to guess if you got a placebo or not. And if you could guess the placebo, I mean, this is a big problem they're having testing psychedelics. Most people know the difference between getting 125 micrograms of acid and getting a placebo. Something like 98% of people can guess which is the placebo arm and which isn't the placebo arm. And this makes it really hard to do placebo-controlled studies. And I think the same is true with cannabis and with kratom because they're psychoactive. People are going to be able to guess that they've been given the active drug as opposed to the placebo. So I think that was a long answer, but I think we've got to be open-minded and judicious about the types of evidence that we include as we're moving forward with these complicated botanical medicines such as cannabis and kratom. And I think that around the world, there's gaining momentum for incorporating real-world evidence to supplement and fill in the gaps for what we do and don't know using just randomized controlled trials.
I'm going to read this quote. It's from page 187 that I think encapsulates kind of the problem here. One of the problems, anyway. You say, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine focuses on memory, learning, and attention in particular that many people perform worse in after they consume weed. If researchers had studied and NASM had looked at creativity, humor, and insight, I suspect there wouldn't have been deficits and people might have done significantly better than the norm. So it seems like there's just the whole problem, especially with research into illegal drugs like cannabis, where they start off looking for the negative results.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of that you could enjoy cannabis, so it must be harmful if you're using it. There's a puritanism, a puritanicalism. If kratom can be used to make you feel better, there must be something wrong with it. Let's assume it's harmful and then prove that it's harmful. And in reality, if we're doing science, not politically biased science, we're going to say, is cannabis harmful or helpful? Not assume a priori cannabis is harmful and then do 50 years of studies to prove that original assumption of harm was true and not fund anybody that's looking for benefits. And I think Kratom faces a similar obstacle. It's been sort of stigmatized and tainted. And again, I'm someone in recovery from addiction. People don't like people who are addicted. There's so much stigma. And if people who are addicted use Kratom and people who have chronic pain use Kratom, it must be something bad and you can get high with it. I think there's just a lot of judgment and stigma. But the fact is, Kratom has, just like cannabis, has medical potential. And there's a lot about Kratom that we just don't know yet about harms and about benefits. So we've got to put the stigma, the voodoo, and the judgment aside and start doing some real neutral, balanced science about these quote unquote drugs of misuse, because we want to learn how to minimize harm and how to maximize benefit. And there's also the issue of like people use them anyways. The safest thing you could possibly do for any drug is to make it legal, regulated, controlled, educate people. And if it's all out in the open, if someone gets in trouble, whether it's cannabis, psychedelics, opiates, or Kratom, they could ask for help. I mean, I truly believe that legal drugs are safe drugs. And the only reason, or one of the main reasons, we're losing 100,000 people a year to opiate overdoses, which is tragic beyond belief, is because these people are using illegal fentanyl. If opiates were legal, nobody would be dying. I mean, this is such a strong argument for the legalization and regulation of Kratom. It gives people an exit ramp. It gives them a way off out of the heroin. So, I think we can do a lot better than we're doing.
And I have no doubt that if Kratom was like illegal nationally, it would only be a couple days before it was mixed with the fentanyl supply. I think the only thing that's saving people now in the states where it's illegal is they can cross the border into a legal state. But also, there's a problem that it's a gray market. There's not enough regulation. There's a lot of lead in the Kratom. There's a lot of contamination, so they don't know what they're putting in their body at this point. I think that's a problem with cannabis too, because it's, even with the legal stuff, you have lab shopping, so they'll put the highest amount of THC on it. So from one strain to the next, or you say chemovar to the next, you don't actually know if you got 30% THC, and then you have 30% and you really like knock you on your ass the next time.
Definitely a huge problem. It's becoming less of a problem as we legalize and regulate. You're absolutely right. There's lab shopping and we haven't legalized in a perfect way by any means. But you look at people in states where cannabis is completely illegal. And that's where people are using like Delta-8 and other synthetic cannabinoids, which don't show up on drug tests. And again, I still will argue to the end of time that legal drugs are safer drugs. They're not completely safe because they're drugs. And the regulatory system isn't perfect. Just as you allude to, there's loopholes and people shop for the labs that'll give them the results. That needs to be cracked down on. That needs to be cracked down on in Massachusetts, which is one of the models for cannabis legalization. And we even have a big problem with that. So we have a lot of work to do. But certainly the more, again, these drugs are legal and out into the open and studied neutrally and available and regulated. So you're not getting the lead, you're not getting the contaminants, the safer they're going to be. I mean, much of the harm comes, I would say much more of the harm comes from the criminalization than from the drug use itself. Particularly with Kratom and with cannabis, and certainly with psychedelics too. So we're making these drugs much more dangerous than they need to be.
And also the research, there's roadblocks in the research when it's illegal. Well, so NIDA they're actually doing good work on Kratom. They're doing a massive real-world assessment right now, and I help to recruit participants and stuff for them. And they are actually going to be able to test the samples of Kratom from a subset of the participants to see what the alkaloid profile is and whatnot. And I'm guessing that NIDA couldn't do this with cannabis because it's still federally Schedule 1?
Absolutely. Cannabis has been federally Schedule 1 since the beginning of the Controlled Substance Act in the early 1970s. And Schedule 1 means no medical utility, which is obviously preposterous. Like there's Marinol, a FDA-approved drug, which is THC for all kinds of indications. And there's Epiledex, which is CBD for childhood epilepsy. Like, how is the government claiming there's still no medical utility when there are FDA-approved medications from cannabis? Not to mention tens of people are using it with obvious, unquestionable medical benefit. With Schedule 1, it also says high abuse liability. Now, cannabis certainly does have some abuse liability, but it's like low to moderate. It's certainly less than alcohol or tobacco. So Schedule 1 of Controlled Substance Act doesn't make any sense. You could even argue it shouldn't be scheduled at all. It doesn't not only not need to be locked away in Schedule 1, you don't need to schedule it as it's safer than alcohol or tobacco, that anyone over 21 to just go and buy. You could just educate people and regulate it. But the Schedule 1 status makes it exceedingly difficult to research any drug. We're also like in that situation with many of the psychedelics and many other drugs. And nobody really wants it to be still in Schedule 1 because everybody wants to research it. So, we're making progress. As I mentioned earlier, Biden says he's going to reschedule it. Hopefully he'll deschedule it. But the way we've criminalized it has just made it very, very difficult to do good research on cannabis, particularly of the benefits. But for example, because of Schedule 1, you can't just get cannabis at a dispensary and test it. You're only allowed to do research on government-grown cannabis, which is just this awful cannabis that's moldy and mushy and has stems and seeds, sort of like what I used to get in high school 45 years ago. And they can't even research the cannabis that people are actually using. So how can you show harms or benefits if you're not even studying what people are using? So we've got to evolve our federal policy in cannabis to make it much easier to do research, because research is literally in everyone's benefit.
That's the actual NIDA farm that's at University of Mississippi. Is that where they get the bad cannabis?
Yeah. I called it moldy mush strain.
Yeah, moldy mush strain, because there was actual mold in it, right?
Yeah, Sue Sicily finally got approval to do research, and they sent her some cannabis, and she's like, what the heck is this? This has seeds, it had stem, it had mold in it. Again, you can't prove harms or benefits with that junk. Very recently, the DEA, under extreme pressure, and NIDA have opened up who can grow cannabis for research. Again, this is under tremendous pressure not to just keep spiking the research like they've done for the last 50 years. So I think things will start to get better. But, as always, institutions move slowly, and it's going to be gradual, the improvement.
You can't just research legal weed from legal recreational states. They can't use any of that for research at all.
I haven't been able to at all.
Okay.
Very recently, there's been some new legislation passed, which I think creates a pathway to being able to do that. So again, this is changing and will change, but it always changes very slowly. And then research takes years to conduct. So we're not going to have good, we're just starting to do it now. So things are improving. It's just very slow.
What led to the idea that cannabis causes psychosis? I guess it was the movie Reefer Madness, probably. But is there any truth at all to it? I mean, can it exacerbate psychosis if somebody's already prone to it? I think you had an example of that with like a young person that you knew in the book.
No, absolutely. Part of the problem is the word psychosis can mean many different things. There are diseases of which psychosis is a part, like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There's substance-induced psychosis. You could take steroids or alcohol or a hallucinogen or amphetamine or cannabis and become psychotic for days to weeks to months just from the substance. And then there's the effect of these drugs or medicines, how you look at them, on people who have a history of psychosis. So the government and the prohibitionists have claimed for 50 years that cannabis, quote unquote, causes schizophrenia. Now, cannabis does not cause schizophrenia. The rates of schizophrenia have been about 1% worldwide since the 1950s, and the use of cannabis has gone from like in the hundreds of thousands to the hundreds of millions over the last 70 years. I mean, 1,000 times more people are using cannabis, and the rates of schizophrenia have remained rock stable at 1%. Cannabis clearly does not, quote unquote, cause schizophrenia. That was just a prohibition talking point, a war on drugs talking point. However, cannabis can precipitate schizophrenia earlier in people who are predisposed to it, as can alcohol, steroids, your Ritalin, your Adderall, as can psychedelics, as can alcohol or tobacco. It's one of many things that can help precipitate schizophrenia earlier. And that is a harm. That is bad. I mean, if you get schizophrenia at 21 instead of 25, those are 4 years where you're ill instead of functioning and learning adult skills and becoming independent. Cannabis also can destabilize people who, with bipolar or with schizophrenia, who use it and have gotten themselves into a level of stability. Cannabis can knock them off their stability. So can steroids, so can psychedelics. Cannabis doesn't have a monopoly on destabilizing people with psychosis, but it certainly can destabilize. So cannabis can precipitate schizophrenia earlier, which is a big harm. Cannabis can cause a substance-induced psychosis like many other substances. Cannabis can destabilize people who have a history of psychosis, which is a really big deal, and they shouldn't be using cannabis or should be using it with extreme caution. But cannabis doesn't cause schizophrenia. So it's a little bit of a nuanced discussion that's been sort of exploited by both sides, particularly the anti-side.
Yeah, and addiction is another issue. You talk about the criteria and the DSM-5 for cannabis use disorder. Most people think of cannabis as non-addictive, but that's not entirely true, is it?
Cannabis can be addictive. The rates of cannabis addiction have been vastly exaggerated by the government and the psychiatric community over the last 50 years. But it's certainly, there are people that get very dependent on it, that give up their goals, that smoke their lives away. I mean, it certainly can be addictive. I treat cannabis addiction. I'm actually good at treating it because I understand cannabis and I'm not judgmental about it. And I understand that the person's probably being helped by cannabis in some ways and harmed in other ways. And you have to figure out what needs the cannabis is meeting and meet them with other modalities if you're going to get someone off cannabis. So it certainly can be addictive. One of the ways in which that they've exaggerated the rates of cannabis addiction, and it's really bad to give someone a diagnosis of addiction to anything if they don't have it. People treat other people, doctors, nurses. If you have a diagnosis of addiction, you get treated with stigma. They don't treat you very well. They don't give you pain medications. It's really harmful to give people a diagnosis of addiction when they don't have it. And the definitions of cannabis addiction have been written to be so broad that they vastly include many people that aren't addicted. For example, they include tolerance and withdrawal. In fact, you only need 2 of 11 criteria to get a diagnosis of quote-unquote cannabis use disorder. And 1 is tolerance and 2 is withdrawal. But all medical cannabis patients have tolerance and withdrawal. So by including these in the definition of addiction, you needlessly pathologize all of these medical cannabis patients. Now, when we prescribe opiates, we don't include tolerance and withdrawal as part of the definition of addiction because virtually all opiate users have tolerance and withdrawal. And why would we needlessly pathologize them with a diagnosis of addiction? So there's a real double standard for cannabis, and we fully need to redefine quote unquote cannabis addiction so that it actually defines people who are having a problem with it and not just everybody who uses it and has some tolerance and withdrawal. So we have a lot of work to do. The final thing I'll say is that, again, people do get addicted to cannabis and it can be quite devastating. But as someone who's in recovery from opiate addiction and who's treated like thousands of people for both cannabis addiction and opiate addiction, I can say that the quality of the addiction is somewhat different. I mean, when people are really addicted to opiates, they'll do anything, rob pharmacies, injure themselves. It's really awful to see, but I've been to so many Narcotics Anonymous meetings. You wouldn't believe what people do to get opiates. And the cannabis addiction, again, can be very destructive to your life, but nobody's robbing dispensaries to get cannabis. They might be robbing dispensaries because everything's in cash because we don't have safe banking and you're not allowed to use credit cards. But again, that's a harm of prohibition, not a harm of cannabis. But the addiction is of a different quality than the addiction to opiates. And certainly it's not lethal like the addiction to alcohol or the addiction to benzodiazepines. So again, cannabis is addictive, but you have to view it in the context of it's been exaggerated, both how severe it can be and how widespread it is.
And a lot of my friends who were former heroin addicts who now take Kratom say the same thing about Kratom, that, and I'm sure because it has like partial opioid agonist, it might be a little more severe than a cannabis addiction possibly, but they say the same thing about the sort of criminal life, that they do anything to get heroin, but not Kratom. And I think there's been a sociological study out of Malaysia that's shown that people have less HIV risk behaviors when they switch to Kratom over like methamphetamine or heroin. But I also thought it was funny. Well, you define addiction, and I think NIDA also defines it as continued use despite negative consequences. But you put yourself yourself through the criteria of caffeine use disorder, if that was such a thing, and you would have scored 11 out of 11. You said it was like a Spinal Tap score that you got there. Turn it up to 11. And, like, to me, my blood pressure went way up over the holidays because it was the holidays, so I quit caffeine for a week, and oh man, I was really irritable, and I actually couldn't sleep, and it was like, wow, I really am kind of like physically dependent on this stuff.
You have tolerance and withdrawal to caffeine.
Yeah.
And if just tolerance and withdrawal were enough to define addiction, we'd all be addicted to caffeine. And why pathologize all of us? Why give us all a diagnosis of addiction? And then the further hypocrisy is that the drugs that we all use, caffeine and alcohol, they don't include tolerance and withdrawal for addiction because we all use these drugs, whereas with cannabis, they do. So again, the whole what is an addiction and how we apply it to these different drugs of misuse is really important because to understand addiction and to educate people can save lives. But at the same time, it's really been weaponized and used as a tool in the war on drugs. And we have to unlearn a lot of stuff, and we've got to redo our definitions so that they maximize benefits and minimize harms.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about the chapter on pregnancy. Everybody, kind of assumes you shouldn't do any drugs during pregnancy, but it's even like some pregnancy studies showing minimal harm were suppressed by the NIH. And even the thing with, the crack babies that turned out to be a big hoax. Not that anybody should use drugs during pregnancy, but it seems like even with that, they've exaggerated the harms.
Well, again, there's what's true, and then there's what have they been telling us during the war on drugs.
Mm.
As a primary care doctor, I'm really conservative about everything during pregnancy. And, some drugs really are harmful during pregnancy. Alcohol is the most harmful. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a real syndrome. It's extremely destructive to use heavy alcohol use during pregnancy. And the other fact is we don't truly know how dangerous or safe any of these drugs are during pregnancy because it's unethical to experiment on pregnant humans. You can't give 1,000 women Kratom and 1,000 women a placebo and see if there are problems with the mom, the baby. That's unethical. Same with cannabis. So then the other point, sorry, this is a complicated issue, is my wife points out if a woman is pregnant and she's having nausea or a migraine or severe pain or can't sleep or severe anxiety, she's got to take something. You can't just say, don't take anything and suffer. So what I tend to look at is what is the least harmful thing that we can give to someone. Like in general, as a doctor, that's what I do. And specifically when they're pregnant, the problem is we don't really know how dangerous these drugs are, drugs/medicines are, kratom and cannabis and psychedelics during pregnancy, because it's not ethical to treat people. And the final thing I'll say is that legal drugs are safer no matter what. So if a pregnant woman's deciding to use cannabis, and a lot of women decide to do that anyways, regardless of what the doctor says, because doctors unfortunately don't have that much credibility on cannabis because they've, as I described in my book, been on the wrong side of the war on drugs for 50 years. If women are going to be using these drugs anyways, if they're safe, regulated, legal, as you mentioned, the kratom doesn't have any lead, the cannabis doesn't have any paraquat or heavy metals, it's going to be much safer for mom and baby. So again, we educate people. We're doing our best to study it. We try to not stigmatize people so that people can get help and tell the truth to their doctor about what they're taking and if they're struggling. And we just make the best judgment we can. It's very difficult.
And in the adults and teens chapter, you talk about cognition problems. There's been a kind of a false diagnosis in the past of amotivational syndrome, I think it was called. The mental health issues have been exaggerated in cannabis, but is there any evidence cannabis causes long-term cognition problems?
Not in adults. Okay. Particularly the brain stops finishes maturating by about age 25. So certainly if you use cannabis modestly after age 25, there's no evidence that it causes cognitive harm. In fact, I just think it affects some things and helps some things and harms others, as we talked about earlier. It certainly does make you not as good at consolidating short-term memories. So if you use cannabis, you'll remember that you had a good time at the party, and you'll probably remember who you talked to, but you won't remember all the details of the conversation because it interferes with that. At the same time, cannabis does help people appreciate art, music. It helps them with their sexuality, with their spirituality, with their connection to other people. We're in this epidemic of loneliness. So I just think that for adults, cannabis harms or suppresses some forms of cognition and facilitates others, so that people are sort of making a choice as to what part of their brain to use, and that there's no long-term harm. For teens, it's a little bit more concerning because their brains are developing and they're forming connections and they're pruning other connections that are extraneous. And, when we use a drug like cannabis, or if the doctor gives you steroids for your asthma or your sciatica or whatever, these are huge doses. They're much higher than the doses that our bodies make. And we just don't know what these huge external doses of THC does to the developing endocannabinoid system in teens. And there's some evidence to show that it can affect brain development in a negative way. Unfortunately, a lot of these studies were done under the war on drugs, and they'd also include, poor kids who are using other drugs and who are smoking and who don't do as well on standardized tests because they're not from privileged backgrounds. And they mixed all this stuff together and blamed it on the cannabis. So the quality of the research is very dodgy. But, where there's smoke, there's often fire, and there's just enough to be concerned that we don't recommend the teenagers use cannabis. We say to teenagers, we don't say just say no. That was a disaster. If you lie about the drug, they're just going to ignore you. We say just say wait, at least until you're 18, so that your brain isn't as vulnerable to the effects of cannabis use.
There's a lot of science about cannabis as a treatment for chronic pain. It's kind of controversial because a lot of the chronic pain patients are being cut off as a result of the CDC guidelines, as a response to the opioid crisis. But is there sort of maybe a pain threshold to where cannabis can't work enough where you have to use opioids? I think you mentioned like if you broke your bone, you probably need some morphine, but then you could maybe treat chronic pain more with cannabis.
Absolutely. Cannabis is very good for mild to moderate pain. For example, like the pain that millions of Americans are getting as they get sort of older and portlier and their knees and back start to go. It's really, really effective for that kind of pain. And for nerve pain, even the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2017, a report came out that there was conclusive evidence that cannabis helps with nerve pain and also with the insomnia and the anxiety that accompanies chronic pain. So I don't think many people are arguing, or sensible people are arguing that cannabis doesn't help with mild to moderate, especially because millions of people are using it with benefit and instead of other more dangerous medications. I mean, it's been shown to lower opiate use and benzodiazepine use and gabapentinoid use, more dangerous drugs. Cannabis is not strong enough, in my opinion, for severe pain. For example, I had to have spine surgery about 5 years ago. The last thing I wanted to do was go on opiates because I was addicted to opiates 15 years ago. But, when you have spine surgery, you're going to be put on opiates. The pain is way too severe. After about 4 days, I was able to switch to transition to cannabis when the pain was moderate. If you break a bone, it's severe pain. You're going to need an opiate. Cannabis just isn't that strong. But for the mild to moderate chronic pain that people have, I mean, what are the other options? You have Tylenol. That doesn't do anything. You have Kratom, but that needs to be legalized and regulated. You have opiates, which are very hard to get, as you mentioned, from a doctor because of the stigma and the government. And also, nobody wants to prescribe them just because so many people are overdosing on them. Even if they're overdosing on illegal opiates, it just scares people away from them. And then finally, the non-steroidals that so many people take, your Advil, your ibuprofen, your Aleve, your diclofenac. These, if they don't give you a heart attack or an ulcer, they kill 10,000 people a year. They kill your kidneys. I have so many patients in their 50s, 60s, and 70s whose kidneys are slowly dying because of all the non-steroidals they took. People think it's over the counter, it must be safe. And we could prevent so much of that with small doses of medicinal cannabis. I think we could do so much harm reduction. The more, as doctors become more educated and fluent with using cannabis, there's tremendous potential to help people.
And with cannabis and opioid use disorder and even opioid withdrawal, it seems like basically the book is like everything. There's an extreme on one side where maybe it's being oversold by the industry, like a bud tender will tell you that, and somebody won't go to a doctor. And then on the other hand, people are saying no, it doesn't work at all for opioid use disorder. You definitely need Suboxone and whatnot. Is there evidence that it works to maybe get people off opioids or with help with withdrawal from opioids?
Well, yes. I think there are 5 ways in which cannabis can help with the opiate crisis, 4 of which I support. Number 1, a new patient with chronic pain, start them on cannabis instead of opiates. Number 2, if a person's on a legacy patient happens to still be on a huge dose of opiates, offer them to transition from the opiates to cannabis. This has to be voluntary. We're not cutting anybody off, but you could certainly offer to give it a try. I'm not at all a believer in cutting people off opiates. All that does is cause misery and suicide. We don't cut people off opiates. Number 3, you could use much lower doses of opiates if you use it with cannabis because they co-work on the same receptors. And that's very good harm reduction if you could lower the dose of opiates with cannabis and still keep people comfortable. Number 4, cannabis is incredibly effective. And I know this personally, as well as from the literature, as well as from thousands of patients I've treated. Cannabis is excellent for opiate withdrawal symptoms. And if someone's trying to get off opiates, it doesn't make their participation in Suboxone programs any worse or methadone programs. It just helps them be more comfortable. It's much better than the pharmaceuticals we give people like Clonidine or whatever we give people for opiate withdrawal. They don't work very well at all. Cannabis is spectacular for opiate withdrawal. The only thing that I take issue with is if someone is addicted to opiates, there's very, very good evidence that Suboxone and methadone a 50 to 80% reduction in overdose deaths. In overdoses and overdose deaths. And we just don't have that data yet for cannabis. So how could you justify using something that you don't have data for that's life or death when you have other medications that you do have data for? So if someone comes to me addicted to opiates and wants treatment, I'll give them Suboxone. And I'll say you could also use cannabis as an adjunct for the chronic pain, for your anxiety, for your insomnia, for your opiate withdrawal symptoms. But we're not using the cannabis as methadone or Suboxone because we don't have the data.
Oh yeah, you just mentioned insomnia, which is another thing. It doesn't work for me, and you said there are some people, and this happens to me, where if I smoke too close to bedtime, I'll get overstimulated, and I'll close my eyes and see a kaleidoscope, and I'll be up all night thinking. Does that have to do with strain? Would CBD along with cannabis maybe help with that, or does it just have to do with how different people's brains work differently?
Well, the answer is yes. And I just have to point out I have to sign off in about 4 minutes.
Okay.
Cannabis helps a lot of people with insomnia, and it is safer than many of the other things we use, such as your Ambiens, your Trazodones, your Benadryls, your Valiums. Generally, it tends to work better for people at low doses than at high doses because it can be quite stimulating at high doses. Cannabis can even cause anxiety, not relaxation, at high doses. Again, as you mentioned, everybody reacts differently. So some people find the cannabis, they fall asleep right away. Like some people can't use it medically or recreationally because boom, they're just out asleep. Other people find it very stimulating. In general, it does have to do with the dose, lowish doses. It does have to do with the strain, more CBD, so it's relaxing. You know, even though indica sativa, that's a whole nother discussion about whether that's an actual distinction. There are certainly indica-like strains of cannabis that are more relaxing, that have terpenes in them, different components of cannabis that make you sleepy. So it is a combination of like how it affects you, your dose, what type of cannabis you use. It's sort of very complicated on one level. On the other level, it's not that complicated. I mean, just like with other sleep medications, if it helps you and doesn't make you groggy the next day and helps you get to sleep, we'll use it. If it keeps you up or you don't like the feeling or you don't feel good the next day, we don't use it. Like a lot of medicine, it's really trial and error.
And I just wanted to ask about CBD. You talk a lot in the book about how it maybe lowers the kind of anxiety effects of THC. And I'm also wondering just about the research they're doing in cancer and the fact that it can be neuroprotective.
Well, CBD works on so many different receptors in the body. The two receptors that doesn't really directly have much interaction with, ironically, are the cannabinoid receptors. but it affects like the serotonin receptors, which is why it can help with anxiety and mood. It's anti-inflammatory. It affects the capsaicin receptors, which is why it helps with chronic pain. And the fact is, the jury's out on a lot of these indications for CBD. We think it helps, and patients certainly think it helps, but the studies are just lagging behind. I mean, sort of the marketing claims have sort of soared above the evidence base. So I think that CBD is non-toxic. I mean, there are a couple things you have to be careful of. You know, your liver enzymes can be affected. You have to make sure that you have a safe source when you're using CBD because it's not regulated. But it's generally a non-toxic. It's non-addictive. It's not impairing. But at the same time, a lot of the claims are being made for it that we're still studying. So with CBD, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but the jury is still out. And fortunately, everybody's studying CBD right now. So I think sooner rather than later, we're going to have some more answers.
What's the future of cannabis? What do you think should happen? What shouldn't happen? What's it going to take to get more cannabis specialists and more doctors' offices and hospitals?
Ideally, the future of cannabis involves federal legalization and complete deschedulized so that people have safe and legal access to it. No more arrests for cannabis possession, no more stigma, no more judgment. This would cause open communication between doctors and patients and would allow people who get into trouble with it to get asked for and to receive help without punishment or judgment or stigma. We need to educate doctors, and we need to research all these questions in a fair and legitimate manner, not like we did during the drug war with a finger on the scale looking for harm. We need to neutrally evaluate the harms and the benefits. And so I think the future is going to be legal cannabis that we understand more and more, both in terms of harms and benefits. And then finally, we need health insurance to pay for it. So it's not just another treatment for the white and the wealthy. It's got to be for everybody. And I have a lot of patients. I work in an inner city clinic as a primary care doctor, and I just have a lot of patients that can't afford it, which is really tragic.
Do you have any Carl Sagan stories?
I do, but unfortunately, I have an appointment in.
All right.
So if you look at my website, which is just www.petergrinspoon.com, you can learn all about Carl Sagan, John Lennon, my dad, my history, my book.
Awesome. Yeah, I thought that was pretty crazy about him smoking pot in your living room. But thank you so much for your time. I'll make sure everybody knows there's a link to the book and whatnot and the website. And I really appreciate your work on cannabis and Kratom.
Well, I appreciate your work on Kratom, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise. The book is Seeing Through the Smoke. A cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana, and that was Dr. Peter Grinspoon. There's a direct link where you can buy that in the description. Check us out on Facebook, TikTok, KR80M Science, and on Twitter at Kratom Science, where every Friday night we've been having a roundtable discussion with other members of the Botanical Action Network. The music is Risey. The song is Memories of Thailand. The Kratom Science podcast is produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.